For the last few weeks or so, we've been taking a look at some older hardware and finding out just how well they hold up against their newer counterparts. Now, a while back we took a look at the first generation Ryzen 5 1600, which we followed up with a look at its second generation upgrade, the Ryzen 5 2600, all to see just how far things have come since Ryzen first launched, and how they stack up against the latest Ryzen 7000 Zen 4 CPUs. Now, we decided the Ryzen 1600 hadn't aged too well, though the Ryzen 2600 was a good step up from that, but it's just, I guess, on the cusp of losing out in terms of performance on newer titles. So the next question is, moving up yet again to a newer generation, is the Ryzen 5 3600 going to see the same step up in performance over its predecessor? Well, that's what we're going to find out today. But before we do, here's a quick word from this video sponsor.
I'm never going to be an esports gamer. I never get any kills.
I wouldn't be so sure of that.
Is that Andy Raffel from eTechnics.com?
Yes, my son, it is me, Andy Raffel from eTechnics.com.
What are you doing here?
I'm here to bestow upon you a gift that will transform you into a true gamer. With a 24.5-inch Full HD screen, 240Hz refresh rate, 0.5 millisecond response time, AMD FreeSync Premium, and height adjustability, you'll be gaming in the big leagues in no time.
Thank you.
No problem, my son. Why don't you check out the link in the description below to find out more.
Now, before we jump into the performance, let me start by saying, for those who haven't seen the Ryzen 1600 and 2600 videos, that we are featuring the Ryzen 5 7600 as mentioned in our other videos. Firstly, we already had all of the testing data, and it just makes sense to include that data with a comparison of the Ryzen 5 X600 lineup of products. It also establishes our end goal of finding the right upgrade path for Ryzen, which means once we get to the Ryzen 5000 series, we can include the 5800X3D, which, before I've even tested, to me just makes the most sense for those clinging onto an older platform, and those who are maybe not quite ready to make that jump over to the newer architecture and DDR5 and all of the other costs that come involved with it. Now, as we make our way up through the Ryzen lineup, we will be able to see the bigger picture and discover what the ideal upgrade path actually is, all depending on which CPU you're using, and of course taking into consideration your budget. It also allows us to see what CPUs are really being held back when it comes to gaming performance. And also, a quick note, all of our testing has been done with the RTX 4090. Now, obviously, it's not a GPU that you'd likely pair with one of these older parts, but it does allow us to eliminate any form of bottleneck and really see what the CPUs are able to do. Basically, we want to see how far each CPU can be pushed with no limitations in other key areas. So for our testing, the Ryzen 3600 was tested on our AM4 test bench, which consists of a Gigabyte X570S Aorus Master with 32GB of Kingston Fury Renegade RGB 3600MHz CL16 memory. Our Ryzen 5 1600 was used on a slightly older Gigabyte X470 Aorus Gaming 7 Wi-Fi due to limitations with CPU support and the same Kingston memory. For the Ryzen 5 7600, we used the Gigabyte X670E Aorus Master and 32GB of G.Skill Trident Z5 Neo 6000MHz CL30 memory. Also, as mentioned, we're using the Inno3D RTX 4090 iChill X30C to eliminate any bottlenecks and to push each CPU as far as we can. All of our tests were done on the latest update of Windows 11 and with each system's latest respective motherboard BIOS. To get a well-rounded idea of how the 3600 performs, we ran it through a total of 42 games, of which we're focused on about 15 or so today, before taking a look at the percentage differences against the Ryzen 7600. This should then give us an idea in regards to upgrade paths and how it compares to a processor that should have less limitations. As always, if you want to see individual charts for all of the games, you can do so over on our Patreon, where you'll get a ton of other cool goodies, including exclusive behind the scenes content, access to our bi-weekly game nights, and it helps support the channel, which in turn makes content like this possible. The link for all that cool stuff is down below. So with all that covered, let's get into those glorious benchmarks. Starting off with the Plague Tale Requiem, where at 1080p we see the 3600 coming in at 117 FPS, taking a strong 27% lead over the Ryzen 2600, which is a much larger performance uplift than we saw between the 1600 and 2600. Despite this increase in performance, it still sits quite a way behind the 7600, which holds 44% faster performance at 169 FPS. Now, there isn't much change as we move up in resolutions, with the 7600 still holding pretty sizable gains, and it's not until 4K where all chips drop within 8% of each other as the GPU handles most of the workload. In Baldur's Gate 3, the 3600 sees strong improvements at 1080p of 23% over its predecessor, which is a larger improvement than the 15% between the 1600 and 2600. The gap between the 3600 and 7600 is almost just as close, with a 25% difference between the two. Again, the CPUs hold a similar position across all three resolutions, but what's actually clear to see is that even with the Ryzen 7600 at all three resolutions, we are being held back, and performance essentially maxes out each CPU, and something that I feel only an X3D CPU or an i9 could garner something higher. The 3600 once again shows a larger generational gap compared to its predecessors in Call of Duty at ultra settings, with gains of 21%, and once again showing a similar size difference between it and the 7600 of 19%. Now the gap does shrink a bit at 1440p, but at 4K all chips start getting held back with much smaller gaps between them, where the workload is simply passed off from the CPU to the GPU instead. Moving on to Cyberpunk at the Ultra preset, the 3600 shows an 18% increase against its predecessor at 59 FPS, though it does fall behind the 7600 by a considerable 42% margin at 1080p. Similar results can be seen at 1440p, with the 7600 taking a strong lead, but they all come together at 4K, with the 3600 managing a 60 FPS average, and the 7600 dropping down to 65, which is more than likely where you'd want to be if running an RTX 4090 anyway, though for anything CPU related, 1080p is the main area of focus. Enabling ray tracing drops the performance by around 17% from 59 to 49 FPS at 1080p, whilst the newer 7600 takes a larger 30% drop from 102 to 78 FPS, though still holds a good lead against the 3600 of 59%. The Ryzen 5 3600 now sits 17% ahead of the 2600 at both 1080 and 1440p, while as expected, 4K sees all of the results draw much closer, but still with the 3600 just ahead of both the 1600 and 2600, while the 7600 sits just ahead of that. F123 shows clear gains with the 3600 that weren't seen between the previous two generations, coming in at 216 FPS, which shows a 30% uplift compared to the 2600 and 1600. Once again, the 7600 holds a massive lead at 382 FPS, which puts it a staggering 77% ahead. The 3600 maintains its performance across all resolutions, with a small drop down to 211 at 4K, just showing that it's limited at all three resolutions, much like the first and second generation Ryzens were when we tested them. Moving up to ultra high and enabling ray tracing, the 3600 still holds a consistent lead over the 2600 and 1600 of over 25%. Again, proving the stronger generational improvements between second and third gen processors when compared to first and second gen Ryzens in the same product tier. Far Cry 6 is similar as the 3600 joins the 1600 and 2600 once again, with big bottlenecks holding the 4090 back across all resolutions, though it does command a 41% improvement over the 2600 at 134 FPS. As we move up in resolution, we find the 3600 coming in with almost identical performance, again showing clear limitations across the board, with the only way of removing that bottleneck through the way of upgrading, as seen by the performance of the Ryzen 5 7600. When ray tracing comes into the picture, the pattern remains the same, just at a lower FPS, with the 3600 scoring 115 FPS at 1080p and maintaining that up through to 4K, albeit within a margin of error at 110 and 111 FPS. This is still a 34% improvement over the second gen processor, but still clearly has limitations that even the 7600 displays at both 1080 and 1440p. Shifting over to Hogwarts Legacy, the 3600 holds an average FPS of 80, which puts it 33% higher than the Ryzen 5 2600, and is still holding out RTX 4090 back by quite a large margin, as we can see from the Ryzen 7600 that comes in 56% faster, though still does have its limitations at both 1080 and 1440p as well. Enabling ray tracing, we see the frame rates drop, but unfortunately even at 1080p, the 3600 sits just under 60 FPS, which is the minimum that most gamers demand, whilst the 7600 sits just above that threshold up until 4K, where it falls below 60 FPS, while the 3600 still comes in 20% slower. There are still gains to be had from the first and second gen Ryzen processors, but nothing that would set the world alight if this is the game you want to play, and with ray tracing turned on. In Spider-Man Remastered, we continue to see how much the older technology is held back, with each chip only seeing small drops as the resolution increases. Again, the 3600 holds a 34% lead over the 2600, however it does fall behind the 7600 by around 31%. These newer titles are really pushing these older pieces of hardware, and it is affecting overall performance quite dramatically. The The results aren't much different when ray tracing is enabled, with all chips holding similar performance as we go up the resolutions, and the newer 7600 still holds a strong lead of around 60% over the 3600. Don't get me wrong, we're now into the more playable territory with the Ryzen 3600, but it's clear to see that a newer title like this is just waiting to have its performance unleashed. Moving over to Ratchet & Clank, we find there are some clear bottlenecks going on at both 1080 and 1440p, with the 7600 sitting ahead of the 3600 by 55% and 51% respectively. At 4K, this changes significantly, and we see the 3600 now only sitting 6% behind the 7600, due to the GPU now taking the majority of the workload. When it comes to generational uplift from this CPU, it's clear that the upgrade from a 2600 or even 1600 is well worth it, as we consistently see uplifts of around 30% from the 2600 and up to around 50% more performance over the 1600. Enabling ray tracing sees a 23% uplift in performance on the 3600 when compared to the older Ryzen 5 2600, though the 7600 comes in with a much healthier margin of 38% at 1080p, showing that we're still being held back by those older CPUs. Even at 1440p, the performance drops as expected, but not by much, while at 4K, the 3600 shows some of the strongest performance for all processors tested, now only sitting 2 FPS behind the newer Zen 4 CPU. Finally, in Starfield, it showcased a solid 33% increase in performance from the 1600 to 2600, and though it is a smaller increase, moving up sees a 21% increase from the 2600 to 3600. This difference is on average maintained as the resolution increases, with only the 7600 seeing a considerable drop at 4K, though that sees its own limitations too at every resolution. So it's very clear that the 3600 gave some pretty big improvements over the 2600, and much more so compared to the increase in performance we saw going from the 1600 to the 2600. I guess the 3600 overall still seems to hold up in modern games, though of course the RTX 4090 that we used has to be taken into consideration. So some less powerful GPUs may need some tweaked settings to achieve a smooth 60 FPS. I think it's still evident to see that even the 7600 has some limitations in certain titles, and the likes of an X3D CPU or higher end Intel CPU is the only way to break through that barrier. But also, I guess not everyone has that kind of money to just splash around. And that's the whole point of this video, to see how things hold up and what makes for a reasonable upgrade in the sense of gaining performance without spending over the odds. Especially as, depending on your motherboard, the 3600 can just be dropped in with a simple BIOS update, though not every board supports this. Now, to give a better impression of how much better performance you would get from upgrading from the 3600 to the latest generation 7600, we actually tested the processors in 42 games to see what kind of performance uplifts we were able to get and to give us a much better picture. Across these 42 games, the 7600 performed 57% faster than the 3600, seeing the biggest gains in the Riftbreaker at 109% and the smallest from Dying Light 2 at just 13%. Across the board though, more than half of the games, specifically 31 of them, sat with improvements of 50% or more in favour of the Ryzen 5 7600. So whilst this is a much smaller percentage difference than we saw going from the 2600 to the 7600, it's still a pretty sizable jump, and just shows how big of an improvement you could get going from a Ryzen 5 3600 up to the 7600 in a long list of the latest titles. Now, what will be interesting is how things look with the 5600 thrown into the mix, and of course the 5800 X3D, which we will be looking at in a future video, so make sure you're subscribed for that. Now, another set of key areas are power consumption and temperatures, and it's here where in terms of power, the 3600 in some cases still comes in quite a bit more efficient. When we look at the likes of Starfield, for instance, where the 3600 uses 16% less power overall, and while we see smaller but still sizable differences in other games like Spider-Man and Baldur's Gate 3, there are some titles where power comes in much closer, like in Far Cry 6 with and without ray tracing, and Hogwarts Legacy with ray tracing enabled, where the 7600 actually comes in the more efficient of the two, albeit by 1 watt. What's clear to see from a combination of our percentage differences and power consumption is that while the 7600 does for the most part use a bit more power, the extra performance that you get kind of more than makes up for that extra power draw. In terms of temperatures, again, the 3600 is the cooler of the two, but that's kind of expected. Even with the large gap differences where the 3600 comes in 16 degrees cooler, like in Starfield or Baldur's Gate 3, the 7600 still only sees a max temperature across a smattering of games of 84 degrees in Cyberpunk 2077, which is still I guess, well within safe limits and nothing with cause for concern. I guess in this day and age, I'd like to think that if you are using one of these processors, you're likely using it with a slightly beefier cooler, whether that be an AIO or just a better air cooler than the stock included heatsink and fan, especially with the cost of coolers dropping quite significantly as of late. So again, this has, I guess, helped us collect more data to get to our end goal of producing content around the typical upgrade path seen through the ages when looking at Ryzen 5 based processors. And it's something where we will collate all of this data right from the Ryzen 5 1600 all the way up to the Ryzen 5 7600 and everything in between to show you exactly what kind of jumps you're likely to get in one easy to digest video. For now, this was kind of all about showing what kind of generational uplift you can get when looking at the 3600 and 7600, and for the most part, the 3600 saw much larger gains going from the 2600 than we saw going from the 1600 to the 2600. While the 3600 is still showing some limitations in certain games, it's still a more than capable processor in the grand scheme of things. Sure, the 3600 is aging a little now, but on its release it saw some big improvements to the IPC, memory support, and just came in as a more, I guess, refined product than we saw before, which is probably, why it did so well in terms of sales, and considering the price disparity between it and its X-branded counterpart, the value for money argument was firmly set on the 3600. While I won't say that you should, ditch the 3600 and go for the 7600 because that is unfair without including the 5000 series processors, there's definitely an argument for it with the 57% bump in improvement. Though, I guess thought has to be given into the extra cost, because it's not as simple as just upgrading the processor and throwing it in. Instead, you're looking at a new motherboard, new memory, maybe even a newer cooler if you are running stock, for instance. And that's why the 5000 series is going to be the real contender here. But sorry to say, you're going to have to wait for us to finish testing that before we can lift the lid on kind of what's the best CPU to upgrade to. Especially with the 5800X3D thrown into the mix. That's really going to, cause a few issues. For now, that's going to do it for this one. Hopefully you enjoyed the video and hopefully you enjoy these little trips down memory lane. If you do, a like and a sub to the channel would be amazing, and if you love what we do, then you can help support us over on Patreon. Along with helping to support us, you'll also get access to a ton of cool benefits, including exclusive behind the scenes content, access to many more charts, bi-weekly game nights, meetups at the eTechnics offices, and much, much more. The link for all that cool stuff is, as always, down below. Thanks for tuning in. I'll see you in the next one. See you later, guys. Bye-bye.